Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those closest to you, family and friends. They're supposed to be your rock, the ones you can trust implicitly. When someone outside your circle betrays you, it stings, but when it's someone within, it feels like a betrayal of trust and a plot against you. That's exactly what I experienced. It took me a long time to heal from that. Family, however, is something you can't easily distance yourself from. You're bound to them. While I'm not sure where the quote originates, its truth is undeniable. If I had the choice, I'd probably cut ties with most of my relatives now without hesitation, but let me explain why. I grew up as the youngest of 3 sons, often overlooked for preferential treatment despite what people typically believe. I got the leftovers in terms of food, the worst chores, and wore hand-me-down clothes exclusively, even though our family could afford better. To illustrate, I didn't taste white meat chicken until I was 14, after my eldest sister had left for college. Back before remote controls were common, I was always the one tasked with changing the TV channel, no matter where I was in the house. Whenever someone wanted to watch something, I was expected to be there to switch channels. It wasn't exactly Cinderella's story, but it wasn't far from it in my eyes. Then Susan Marsden entered my life. My brother Wayne and I observed as the moving truck arrived at the old Johnson house 3 doors down. A dark blue Chevrolet station wagon parked in front, and a man, a woman, a boy, and a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl emerged. My heart raced, I began to perspire, and my stomach churned, a sensation that would become familiar over the next couple of decades. Jeffy and Blondie sitting in a tree, kissing, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes Jeffy pushing a baby carriage, Wayne teased in a childish sing-song manner. When I was 8 years old, I didn't fully grasp the meaning of the little tune, but I was old enough to understand that Wayne thought I had a crush on the new girl, which wasn't something any boy my age wanted to admit. Girls were considered off-limits, even if they looked like blonde-haired, blue-eyed angels. Despite the chaos in my mind, I couldn't confess that to my annoying 10-year-old brother. "Shut up, idiot," I blurted out. "Oh, you think you're tough, huh?" he retorted. At that point, Wayne had a significant size and weight advantage over me, making it clear I wouldn't stand a chance in a fight, although I had attempted it unsuccessfully in the past. But at that moment, I didn't want to appear weak in front of the most beautiful girl I'd ever met up close. 12-year-old Eddie and 8-year-old Susan Marsden were the only other children on our street, so it was natural for my siblings and me to spend a lot of time with them. Because of our ages, Susan and I often played together. She was somewhat of a tomboy and could throw a baseball and a football almost as well as I could. We swiftly formed a strong bond, becoming best friends in no time. Despite her forging connections with other girls in our small rural town, we remained each other's primary confidants until almost the end of our 8th grade year. While we had never kissed by then, we occasionally intertwined our hands, whether at school or in public. Despite teasing from my male friends, I secretly relished it because I considered her the most beautiful girl in town, and she still managed to quicken my heartbeat. Just before the school year's end, my world seemed to shatter. Josh Archer, our freshman football team's quarterback, invited Susan to the end-of-year freshman mixer at the high school, and she eagerly accepted. I thought we were together, I whimpered when she mentioned her date, struggling to hold back tears in her presence. "Well, you never actually asked me to be your girlfriend, and besides, he's a high school guy and the quarterback of the freshman football team," she exclaimed joyfully. "Yeah, whatever," I muttered as I turned away from her and the group of excited girls surrounding her, entering my house feeling utterly awful. My brother approached, appearing as though he was about to impart some wise elder brotherly counsel. After all, wasn't he the experienced sophomore? "Blondie really got you good, huh?" he jeered, using a swear word that caught our mother's attention. Even Wayne's week-long grounding for swearing didn't ease the pain of losing my girlfriend. Mom attempted to console me by insisting it was just one date and didn't signify that Susan no longer liked me, as if I could believe that. I refrained from visiting Susan's place, and she didn't come to mine in the week leading up to the freshman mixer. I resisted the temptation to loiter outside just to catch a glimpse of her when Josh Archer's dad drove him over to pick her up. Blondie looked stunning, really. They made quite the pair, my brother sarcastically remarked. Upon returning home a few minutes after Mr. Archer departed, Susan and I maintained our distance throughout the rest of the school year. In the summer, we'd exchange waves, but neither of us made an effort to initiate conversation. I won't deny it. I was miserable, but it seemed like she had moved on. Meanwhile, I hadn't. I barely interacted with any other girls and spent most of my free time playing baseball during the day and basketball in the evenings. I was fairly good at sports, and by keeping myself occupied, I managed to avoid dwelling too much on Susan. Well, mostly. My brother kept me informed about her activities, especially her dating life. He always made sure to update me whenever she went out with someone new. My parents noticed Susan's absence from our family gatherings multiple times. My brother took delight in sharing stories of seeing her with different guys. However, my sister Diana often defended me by pointing out that my brother wasn't exactly successful with girls either. I might ask Blondie out. She's always been friendly towards me, my brother excitedly suggested. If she goes out with you, I'll make sure you regret it. I shouted. While I was focused on my brother, I didn't anticipate the slap from my father, which hit me hard on the face and side of my head, nearly knocking me out of my chair. You're fortunate you're too far for me to reach, my dad warned my brother, but let me make this clear. If I find out you're messing with Susan, there will be consequences, and they won't be gentle. Understand? Yes, sir, Wayne grumbled. The first week of my freshman year was a revelation. Previously unnoticed by most girls except Susan, suddenly I became the center of attention as every pretty freshman girl seemed eager to get to know me. Having grown 4 inches and gained 25 pounds over the summer, I now stood at 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, with my longish dark brown curly hair and big brown eyes. I wasn't too bad looking, I suppose. I also discovered that not being tied to Susan's side turned out to be advantageous for me. Initially, I was taken aback by the attention the freshman girls showered on me, but I have to confess, I enjoyed it. I went out with a few different girls initially before choosing a petite, adorable redhead with vivid green eyes as my girlfriend, I said. Erin Jin was always lively and pleasant to be around, which is why she made it onto the freshman cheerleading squad. Plus, she had full, inviting lips that I had the pleasure of kissing regularly. Life was good. 2 days after the Christmas dance, Mom escorted Susan into my room, informing me I had a visitor and to keep the door open. Both Susan and I blushed. Jeff, I made a mistake when I went out with another guy last year while we were together, but I was too afraid to admit it to you, she confessed. I've dated several guys since then, and I now realize you were the best. I want us to get back together. I was seated on my bed, engrossed in a book when Susan entered the room. I remained motionless as she spoke. It took me several seconds to respond, sitting there in silence before eventually nodding in understanding. If we proceed with this, there are no ifs, ands, or buts. You're my girlfriend, and that means you can't see or be involved with another guy. Clear? No flirting, no kissing, nothing of that sort. If you do anything suspicious, we're over. Finished. For good, I clarified. I understand, she murmured. But first things first, I need to end things with Erin. She's a really wonderful girl. I care about her a lot. Yeah, I know. I witnessed how close you two were at the Christmas dance, I said. I felt it should have been me by your side, not some other girl. Erin took the news as well as could be expected. I knew I was in the wrong for breaking up with her, but Susan and I quickly reconnected, now with the added element of kissing and occasional discreet touching from my end. Typically, this would earn me a raised eyebrow followed by a swift smile from her. She was my partner in every sense of the word. Despite other guys attempting to pursue her, some of whom I was aware of, she remained faithful to her word. We made the joint decision to attend the University of Wisconsin in Madison for our freshman year. We resided one floor apart in the same dormitory. However, for the subsequent 3 years, we shared an off-campus apartment. While both sets of parents were aware of our living arrangements, though not entirely approving, they were mostly accepting. Susan had to assure her parents that she would remain on birth control until after graduation. In fact, we tied the knot after our sophomore year. Our parents graciously hosted a lovely wedding for us. The event proceeded smoothly until near the end when Wayne decided to inappropriately touch my newlywed wife while dancing to a slow song. I happened to be across the room, but within moments, I intervened swiftly, removing his hand from her and delivering a punch to his mouth. "Ouch!" he exclaimed amidst the blood gushing from his gums. "I've warned you before, you jerk. You never lay a hand on my wife." I shouted at him, as onlookers rushed to separate us. After regaining composure, the rest of the wedding went smoothly. I didn't dwell on the fact that my wife never intervened when my brother had his hand on her rear. Susan and I returned to our hometown after graduating. I landed a job as an editor at a small magazine group, while Susan worked for a non-profit until we started a family. Once our children came along, she became a stay-at-home mom. My income allowed for this arrangement, though I knew I wouldn't be making a fortune. My bothersome brother ceased to be an issue when he relocated to California a year later with his wife of 2 years. He had always been skilled at smooth talking, which served him well in his job in television advertising sales. According to my mother, he found considerable success, living in a lavish home in an upscale neighborhood. I was genuinely happy for him, although secretly relieved that our encounters would be infrequent. Time flew by, as it tends to do. 2 years into our marriage, Marianne was born, instantly becoming the center of my world. 2 years after that, we completed our family. At 38, Susan still had the power to quicken my pulse. We were both dedicated fitness enthusiasts, and I admired her physique, which seemed just as impressive as it did when we first got married. Despite her having 2 children, in some ways, it seemed even better. Her breasts were slightly larger, and her hips and buttocks had gained a touch more curvature. Overall, she had become a more mature version of herself, and I felt grateful that she was mine. The phone call from my mother was devastating. Despite never having smoked, my brother had been diagnosed with lung cancer, and his doctor estimated he had about 2 years left to live. Apparently, he had been experiencing symptoms for several months but had largely ignored them until he could no longer manage on his own. By this point, Wayne had been married and divorced twice. Neither of his ex-wives had been able to tolerate his unfaithfulness, but at least there were no children involved. The luxurious house he once owned had been lost in the divorces, and he was now living alone in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a less affluent neighborhood. Despite having a successful career, it was clear that Wayne would need support in the future, and Mom had some ideas about how we could all come together to assist him. She called for a family meeting the following Sunday, expecting my wife Susan, my sister Diana, her husband Ronnie, and me to gather at our parents' house. A lot of decisions were made during the meeting. Wayne expressed his desire to remain in his home for as long as possible, despite the inconvenience it posed to those who would assist him, considering that the rest of the family lived halfway across the country. Ultimately, it was agreed that the 3 women in the family, my mother, sister, and wife, would take turns living with and aiding Wayne on a rotating basis. Since my wife didn't have a job and our kids were old enough to help at home, Susan would stay with Wayne for 4-week intervals, effectively taking 2 turns for every one of my sisters and mothers. Meanwhile, my mother and sister, both employed, would stay for 2 weeks each. The rotation would consist of Diana for 2 weeks, Susan for 4 weeks, then my mother for 2 weeks, followed by another 4 weeks with Susan, before repeating the cycle. Surprised, I questioned my wife about the origin of this elaborate schedule. I understand that you're the one with more flexibility since you don't work, but you also have 2 children to care for at home. Marianne can drive now and she can assist with taking Will to his sports practices and other activities, she replied. The 3 of you will need to be more efficient when I'm not home, and I'll have to be more organized when I am. We have to do what we can for Wayne, that's what family does, she concluded. I couldn't argue with that, even if I was taking the biggest hit in this deal. Despite my brother being difficult, he was family, and my children and I could adapt. We had a video call with Wayne from our parents' living room. He was overcome with emotion about the women volunteering to help, which made everyone here emotional too. It felt like a scene from a sentimental Hallmark Channel movie. Before Susan left for her first shift in California, the kids, Susan, and I had a family meeting. The kids understood that Uncle Wayne needed assistance, so they promised to help me at home. Susan also prepared several meals in advance before leaving for Wayne's. I'm grateful for what you're doing for the family, babe, I told Susan. Just remember you're there to assist Wayne, not be his personal servant. Don't let him manipulate you and don't buy into any of his nonsense, I added. She nodded with tears in her eyes and went through the airport gate. During Susan's first shift in California, the kids and I spoke to her about every other day. She said Wayne was in good spirits and still capable of most tasks. When she returned home, all 3 of us went to the airport to pick her up. Her 2 weeks at home flew by, and before we knew it, she was heading back to California. Once again, she had prepared meals for us, and the 4 of us spent a lot of quality time together. When she was home, it felt like our family had grown closer. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, but something felt amiss during our conversation with Susan on her second shift in California. I wondered if the kids sensed it too, but I refrained from asking them. Susan appeared somewhat preoccupied while talking with us. I assumed Wayne's decline was progressing faster than expected, and my wife was deeply affected by it. I reiterated to her several times, we can adjust things if it's becoming too difficult for us. No, it's fine. Sometimes I just need to remind myself how lucky we are to have each other. Wayne doesn't have a wife or kids, he's all alone here except for me, Diana, and Mom when we're around. That must be really tough, she replied. We had managed well during Susan's absence, and the household was functioning fairly smoothly. Personally, the adjustment was a bit challenging without my partner and best friend by my side every day. Additionally, there was the absence of intimacy with Susan as our physical connection went from 3 times a week to 0 during the month she was away. I wondered if she felt that absence too. I went alone to the airport to pick up Susan the second time, and if I'm honest, I considered booking a hotel room so we could be intimate before driving home. My desire was overwhelming, and my arousal left no room for comfort in my jeans as I drove to the airport. When I arrived at the airport, I had to spend a few minutes in my car to calm down my intense arousal. My wife had been away for 2 months out of the last 10 weeks, and I was incredibly horny. I was worried I might embarrass myself in the airport. As she walked towards me through the gate, she was dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, yet to me, she appeared as beautiful as if she were wearing a ball gown. Although I noticed she seemed tired as she approached, I was too caught up in my excitement to dwell on it. It wasn't until she didn't reciprocate my kiss with equal enthusiasm that I realized something might be wrong. When I pulled back from her, I stole a glance at her downcast eyes. She looked fatigued, and my initial thought was that my brother's health issues must be taking a toll on her more than she admitted. Another thought crossed my mind, but it felt too selfish to dwell on for long. My previous excitement evaporated, and I was acutely aware of Susan's demeanor during the drive home. Conversation was sparse, and I think we both sensed something was amiss. As usual, the kids swarmed around their mother when we arrived home, which relieved some of the tension between Susan and me. They chattered away to her for probably an hour after she returned, though she didn't say much. Her tired smile reassured the kids that everything was fine, at least from their perspective. After the children finally went to bed, I approached Susan and asked if taking care of Wayne was becoming too much for her, either physically or mentally. For the first time since she arrived, she appeared to have some energy. "What's on your mind, Jeff? Do you doubt my ability to handle this?" "I'm just a bit tired. Sitting in an airport for hours and then enduring a long flight is always draining. I've got this. Me, Mom, and Diana are here for Wayne," she snapped at me. "All right, no problem. I understand. You just seem a bit worn out, that's all," I replied, rising from my chair and heading into the kitchen ostensibly to grab a drink. Since I had work the next day, I went to bed at 11 o'clock, trying to persuade Susan to join me for reasons that I thought were obvious. Apparently not obvious enough, as she informed me she would stay up for a while longer. I'm sure my jaw dropped when she said that. Here I was, practically yearning for some intimacy after a month alone, and Susan acted as if she had no desire whatsoever. After a restful night's sleep, my wife appeared to be in significantly higher spirits when I returned home from work the following evening. She prepared a delightful dinner and exuded a more cheerful demeanor, although I couldn't shake the feeling that her smile lacked sincerity. Later that night, we shared intimate moments in bed, but I couldn't shake the sense that she was not fully engaged. It left me questioning if she truly cared. I wasn't the sole observer of Susan's behavioral shift. On Friday, Marianne approached me and proposed going for a stroll together after dinner. "Hey Dad, what's going on with Mom?" Marianne inquired as we began walking. "Something seems off. Did you do something?" I understood Marianne's implication, yet I lacked a response. As far as I'm aware, the only fault I may have is simply being myself. It seems Uncle Wayne's health is declining rapidly, and I suspect your mom might be grappling with depression, unsure of how to convey it to us. "Well, at least that's my hope," I replied. My daughter isn't easily fooled, and my response didn't fully satisfy her. "You're not concerned that she might be developing feelings for Uncle Wayne, given how close they've become due to his illness? I've observed her on the phone with him, and she behaves like a teenager with a crush. She didn't realize I was home when he called her. It was rather disturbing. She was giggling and made some remarks that I would consider inappropriate for a married woman. What should we do?" To be honest, I'm not sure if I replied. If it's just a fleeting infatuation from their bond, I might tolerate some of it. But if it's more than that, I'm traditional when it comes to marriage vows. Maybe if she's breaking those, we might be in trouble. I hope she hasn't, Dad. I don't want to see you two divorced, but I'd understand if she's crossed that line. Susan seemed almost relieved to be returning to California the following Sunday. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. We had only been intimate 6 times in the 2 weeks she was home after a month apart, and our connection was lacking both inside and outside the bedroom. We were little more than friends with benefits. Perhaps we should consider hiring professional help for Wayne if this is becoming too much for you, Mom, or Diana, I suggested as she headed to her gate. Remember, you have a family that needs you while you care for Wayne. Don't forsake us for him. How dare you, she snapped. I'm busting my butt looking after your brother. You're just a selfish jerk. I may be selfish, but I'm not foolish. Getting too involved with Wayne wouldn't be good for our marriage, I retorted. The following night, I reached out to my parents to discuss my concerns. However, my mother's response was dismissive, even accusing me of being selfish for worrying. When I mentioned to them that I wouldn't tolerate any interference from my brother in my marriage, even if he were in dire circumstances, I felt a pang of discomfort. "You can't mean that, Jeff." "He's your brother," she countered. "Do I truly care for them that deeply?" Well, I was disappointed by my mother's reaction. My father's laissez-faire stance didn't surprise me. Throughout my childhood, he consistently favored my brother over me, and it seemed nothing had changed in adulthood. My love for Susan had been unwavering since childhood. Despite my suspicion that she had crossed boundaries with my brother, my love for her compelled me to give her the benefit of the doubt, albeit to the limit of my self-respect. Some might interpret it as my ego, but whatever the label, I needed to maintain my integrity and self-worth. My daughter eagerly assisted in my plan. She discreetly acquired Susan's keys while she was at home and had a copy made. I intended to visit my brother's home unannounced, prepared to stay for several days if necessary, to ascertain the truth firsthand. I waited for 2 weeks into my wife's stay in California before flying out myself, arriving at Wayne's house in a rental car. I entered at 2 a.m., holding onto a sliver of hope but deep down knowing what awaited me, finding them both asleep in Wayne's bed. Carrying a pot of cold water into the room, I poured it over their heads, prompting shocked screams as they tossed off the covers, revealing their nakedness. Their screams turned to threats once they saw me standing there, holding my phone. "If you weren't dying, I'd kill you," I shouted at my brother. "And as for you, if you can't understand, we're finished. You don't have to return home after your month is up, you can stay here with him until he passes." Susan, sobbing, attempted to shield herself with her hands, though it was futile. "Really, Susan? Everyone in this room has already seen it all. Modesty should have come before you slept with my despicable brother," I spat. "I'm sorry, Jeff," she sniffled. "He's dying, and I thought I was comforting him. He's family, so I thought it was okay." "Nice try. If you wanted to comfort him that way, you should have hired an escort instead of acting like I'm not he's family. It was the right thing to do. Even your mom said so." "My mom? My mom thought this was a good idea?" I cried out. "Well, yes, her and Diana, discussed doing something for Wayne, and this is what we decided on. He won't be able to do this much longer, so we started last month. So you, Deanna, and Mom all agreed this was a good idea, and you never thought to inform me, your husband, supposedly the person you're closest to in the world, the one you vowed to fly to years ago? If it was such a brilliant idea, why wasn't I included? Were you ever planning on telling me?" Wayne apparently decided it was a good moment to share his thoughts with me. "Relax, Jeffy, your wife is an incredible woman and incredible in bed," my brother interjected. "Nobody said anything to you because you're a jerk, and we all knew you wouldn't handle it well. And we were right. So you were all in on this brilliant plan? Fantastic. The one who cheats gets a say, but not the faithful husband who's kept in the dark," I remarked. "Well, you're right. I'm not okay with this sharing my wife thing. You can have her. I'll find someone else, someone who'll be loyal to me." "No, Jeff, this isn't permanent. Wayne's dying. Jeff, show some compassion," Susan pleaded. "Are you serious, woman? My compassion was letting you take care of him for a month at a time, not sleeping with him like some loose woman," I retorted. "Stop calling me that. I'm not loose. You're having sex with a man who's not your husband. That's what I call loose, even if you disagree." I countered, "Who cares what he thinks?" Wayne chimed in, "I think you're a wonderful sister-in-law, Susan." Susan and Wayne put on robes, and she began changing the wet sheets. "So, how long has this been happening?" I questioned my wife. I could see she was trying to cushion the blow somehow. Lying wasn't something she was good at, or at least it hadn't been in the past. "We started sleeping together the last month I was here. He doesn't have much time left, Jeff," she pleaded tearfully. "Please spare me the innocent act." We all know you're unfaithful and he's a cheater." End of story, I grumbled. During much of the argument, my brother lingered on the outskirts, wearing a smirk that seemed to suggest he held the key to life's ultimate question. As soon as Susan carried the sheets to the washing machine, he seized the opportunity to take a jab, confident that I wouldn't retaliate against the dying man. "You know, bro, she's amazing in bed, and it didn't take much to persuade her to move into my room." "You want to know why, bro?" "Because I could." I triumph, Jeffy. I triumph. "You've been insufferable your entire life, Wayne. I suppose it's no surprise you'd be even more insufferable when you're on your deathbed. I hope you burn in hell, literally. Enjoy what's left of your life, if you can, scumbag." I turned and left the house, heading back to the airport. I boarded a jet home before 8 a.m. I was dozing on the family room couch when my kids entered the room. I stood up and hugged each of them. "Since you're back so soon, I'm assuming it didn't go as we hoped," Marianne remarked. Damn, I was hoping to make it through high school with both parents still married. Apparently, Marianne had filled her brother in because he was nodding in agreement. "I'm sorry, Will. I should have talked to you too. I was hoping you hadn't noticed much of what was going on and that I wouldn't have to explain," I said. "Damn, I've loved that woman practically my whole life." "So that's it, Dad? You're not going to forgive her?" my son inquired. "It's complicated, Will. Marriage. Fidelity. It's complicated. But when one partner betrays the other, saying sorry doesn't erase the hurt and the betrayal. It's like killing someone and then saying sorry. The damage is done, so how meaningful is the apology? She tore my heart out, she broke my trust, she disrespected me. I'm sorry just doesn't cut it, I clarified. The anguish reflected in his eyes communicated his comprehension of my words. Children seem to mature rapidly in today's world. Given the current divorce rate surpassing 50%, it's likely he has several acquaintances whose parents have separated. "How about pizza for dinner tonight?" "I'm not really up for cooking." "We can chat while we eat," I suggested. They both agreed with nods over a large pepperoni and sausage pizza. I disclosed everything to my children. Needless to say, tears were shed, and I'm not ashamed to say that many of them were mine. I also enlightened my kids about the deceitfulness of their grandmother and aunt. They were just as surprised and furious as I was. I found it intriguing that neither my mother nor sister had reached out to apologize or clarify matters. I was certain Susan had spoken to both of them by now. I anticipated receiving a swift and forceful response from the sisterhood soon. The following day, without delay, I arranged a meeting with a lawyer I had reached out to before traveling to California. I already had a sense of what awaited me at my brother's house. The trip was merely for confirmation. Despite my hope to be proven wrong, deep down I knew it was unlikely. It's akin to attempting a swift movement in front of a mirror, expecting it not to capture every detail, though in reality, it does. Perhaps it sounds absurd, but we've all tested it at some point, haven't we? That evening, the first call for sisterly reconciliation came from my mother. Though it felt more like an attack than an apology, it seemed the women had opted for an aggressive approach as their defense strategy. "He's on his deathbed, Jeff." She was just trying to bring some comfort to his final days. "And let's not forget, he's family, not a stranger," Mom insisted. The moment I answered, "She's my wife, damn it, Mom," I snapped into the phone. She had no right. You could have intervened, perhaps, but instead, you and Diana egged her on, pushed her to give Wayne what was supposed to be exclusively mine, without even consulting me on this insanity. He's had a thing for her since we were kids. This wasn't some charity case, Mom. His impending death didn't entitle him to her affections, not multiple times. I heard my mother gasp as I dropped the first F-bomb on her. It was a tone I had never used with her before. Too bad, I thought, knowing more expletives would follow in the future. "Don't you dare use that language," was all she managed before I ended the call. She wasn't in a position to lecture me, I decided. My phone rang immediately after I hung up. "How dare you!" I disconnected again swiftly, followed by another call. This time, silence greeted me. Maybe old habits could change. "Jeff," she cautiously asked, "you're not going to hang up on me again, are you?" "New rules, Mom," I replied. "If you try to lecture me, I'll hang up. You forfeited that right when you encouraged my wife, to cheat on me with my brother, all because he's dying. You're my mother, for God's sake. You shouldn't be encouraging my wife, to cheat on me, even with my dying brother. What kind of mother does that to her own son?" She coughed on the other end. "But he's dying," she interjected suddenly, her energy seemingly renewed by her declaration. "To hell with him. To hell with him. To hell with him." I shouted back. Dying doesn't excuse him from wrecking my marriage. It didn't excuse her for sleeping with him, and it didn't excuse you and Diana for pushing her to ruin my marriage. This won't ruin your marriage unless you allow it. He'll be gone soon, and you and Susan can move on. He won't even be a consideration," she stated. "Or HEK always linger in my mind, and maybe in hers too," I retorted. "Do you have no forgiveness in your heart?" Mom asked. "No, I don't," I replied. "Would you forgive Dad so easily if he slept with Belinda Parker?" "Belinda Parker? That blonde woman who lived across the street when you were kids?" I could hear flecks of saliva practically propelled from Mom's mouth as she spoke. Belinda Parker, a stunning woman, moved in across the street with her husband when I was a teenager. She was roughly 10 years younger than Mom, and I recall seeing her in a tiny bikini heading to the mailbox by the road multiple times during the summer. Whenever Belinda appeared, Mom consistently made snide remarks at the dinner table. It probably had something to do with Dad's eyes practically popping out of his head when he caught sight of our younger neighbor once. "Would you have let Dad sleep with Belinda Parker if she was on her deathbed?" I inquired. "That's a nonsensical comparison," she snapped at me. "Clearly not," I replied quietly. My sister phoned after 2 days, sounding apologetic, which was a relief. "I regret not realizing the obvious sooner," Diana admitted. "We all got carried away with Wayne's illness and lost our better judgment, even disregarding our family ties. I shouldn't have encouraged Susan to cheat on you just because Wayne was dying." Ronnie was furious when I confessed what Susan did with both my and Mom's support. "He hasn't spoken civilly to me since then and even said you'd be justified in punching me. Looks like I'll need to work hard to regain his trust," she sighed. An hour later, Ronnie called to apologize sincerely for my sister's actions. "I had no idea, Jeff. I'm truly sorry. If I'd known, I wouldn't have condoned such stupidity." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I've made up my mind, Ron. While Wayne may have tempted her, Susan had agency. Using his illness as an excuse was just that, an excuse. She chose forgiveness over permission, especially with Mom and Diana pushing her. And it's not a one-time mistake, she's been involved with him for the past 2 months. I've got your back, Jeff. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you," Ronnie assured. I waited until Susan's plane had taken off before calling her parents to inform them about what their daughter had been up to in California with my brother. As expected, given my long-standing familiarity with them, they were both embarrassed and appalled upon grasping the truth of the matter. "Seriously, Jeff? Is this some sick joke?" her father yelled through the phone. "No joke, Dad. You know I wouldn't jest about something like this. He's always harbored feelings for Susan, and it seems he decided to make a move thinking he had nothing to lose. I'm not sure if my mother and sister were aware of his intentions beforehand, but I know they encouraged her, I explained. She's far too intelligent to fall for such nonsense, my father-in-law sighed. I'm sorry. We apparently raised a promiscuous daughter, Jeff. I'm utterly shocked. I assume you'll be divorcing her? Yes. I won't tolerate this, and I could never regain trust in her, I affirmed. She'll be served with divorce papers once she lands. I waited until Susan's plane was airborne so that my in-laws wouldn't have a chance to warn her beforehand. Although the scolding she would receive from them wouldn't really serve as a warning, I wanted her to be completely caught off guard, hoping it would inflict as much pain on her as her betrayal had on me. If anyone should understand that I can be vengeful, it's Susan. She should be aware that I intend to exact retribution several times over. I wasn't surprised when she didn't call for 2 weeks. After I caught her, she understood that a hollow, insincere apology would only aggravate me further. She knew from experience that the best way to calm my anger was to be physically close to me, in our bed, with me fully immersed in her warmth. It was a tactic she had used successfully before, but this time was different. This was more than just a disagreement, it was a betrayal. As usual, I was there waiting for her when she emerged, but this time there were no embraces or kisses. Her shocked expression told me she wasn't expecting this, but she was truly surprised when a young man approached her and handed her a legal envelope, serving her papers. After 19 years, you couldn't even have me served in the privacy of our home, she murmured softly. After you didn't even have the decency to tell me about your affair, forcing me to find out on my own, you're fortunate I didn't take drastic measures when I found you two together. But neither of you are worth going to jail for. He'll meet his end soon enough, and as for you, you'll just be a painful memory, hopefully one I can eventually bury deep in my mind like a regrettable mistake. Tears trickled down her cheeks quietly as she struggled to restrain herself from crying in public. Instinctively, I retrieved a tissue from my shirt pocket and offered it to her. The journey back home was mostly quiet, a state of affairs that suited me well. Perhaps curiosity eventually overcame her, for just before reaching the house, she inquired about who was aware of her lapse in judgment, as she phrased it. I couldn't help but chuckle at her wording, eliciting a pained expression from her. The children and your parents are now aware. None of them are pleased. My family was already aware, except Ronnie, who was furious at my sister when I informed him of his wife's involvement. Their marriage is in jeopardy because my brother-in-law is extremely angry at my sister for supporting my wife's heartless betrayal of me, my words, not his. His language was much harsher. The silver lining for you is that my parents still view your actions as profoundly compassionate. Naturally, they would. They've never been subtle about favoring their other son. I suppose it's unfortunate that I'm not the one facing mortality. Don't speak like that, Jeff, they both care about you, I interjected, almost as much as they adore Wayne. When we arrived home, the children greeted Susan with only mild enthusiasm. She was hurt by their apparent lack of excitement at her return. She would have been devastated if I hadn't persuaded the children to at least show respect to Susan. Later that evening, Susan's parents called and were less than welcoming. She had her phone on speaker, so we all heard her mother call her a derogatory term. After that, she took her phone off speaker and left the room. Grandma is extremely angry. I've never heard her use language like that before, Marana remarked right after Susan left the room. I wouldn't be surprised if she wanted to ground Mom for a couple of weeks at least. Susan's flushed complexion spoke volumes as she re-entered the room following the phone call. Without a word, the children quietly exited as if following an unspoken cue. We sat in silence for a few moments before Susan broke it. Do you really think rushing into a divorce, Jeff, is the right move? We haven't even discussed things since you found out about her. Voice trailed off. Rushing? You've been involved with my brother for some time now. I've given you plenty of leeway, I'd wager you never even stopped while you were staying with him those 2 weeks after I found out, I retorted sharply. Her expression twisted in displeasure, confirming my suspicions. He's dying, Jeff, he doesn't have much time left. It's the least I can do, she protested weakly. Are you planning to sleep with other terminally ill people too? That would surely bring joy to many, I remarked sarcastically. He's family, Jeff, what do you expect, she countered. I see you as someone who used this situation as an excuse to be with my brother, I shot back. She pursed her lips, her eyes blazing with anger. I didn't flinch, meeting her glare head-on. We gave each other our virginity, Jeff, remember? You're the only man I've been with. Have you ever thought about being with another woman? She admitted finally. Some honesty, but it wouldn't change anything. I've thought about it, of course, but I've never acted on it because I'm committed to our marriage, because I love you. I made vows to you, and I intend to keep them. I would have been content to spend my life only with you, I asserted. I could sense her unease. I could observe her mental struggle to find a response. He'll be gone soon. Only our families know what happened, nobody else needs to find out, Susan complained. So we're bargaining now, I interjected. You want to keep sleeping with my damn brother until he's spent, then reunite with me pretending nothing happened and live happily ever after? Well, I can't just stop now, Jeff. He doesn't have much time left, it would be cruel to stop, she justified. That's probably the worst thing you could have said, Susan, I retorted even. If you promised never to be with Jeff again, our chances of reconciliation were slim. But now you're trying to negotiate more time with him. You're either incredibly naive or shamelessly promiscuous. I don't give a damn that he's dying, our marriage is dying, that should matter more to you. Apparently, it didn't matter much because at the end of her 2 weeks at home, she returned to California as if nothing else existed. I didn't ask, and she didn't say, but I assumed she was still involved with my brother, even though I knew his health was deteriorating rapidly. While Susan and the kids continued regular communication, Susan and I only spoke about once a week. During those calls, she would gently remind me of his declining health and her imminent return to me. I never acknowledged those remarks. When she called about a week before heading home, I sensed something was different from her cautious tone. I wondered if Wayne was close to passing. When she quietly shattered any hope of reconciliation, I'm pregnant, Jeff, she practically whispered. I barely caught her words, but they registered nonetheless. My response was delayed as I processed the implications. That's tough news, Susan, I eventually managed. What? She responded sharply. The judge will postpone the divorce until after the baby arrives. No, he won't, I countered. The child isn't mine, so it won't affect the proceedings. I could claim it's yours, she suggested. Lying in court is perjury, I warned. You could face serious consequences. Plus, DNA tests can differentiate between close relatives after a couple of months of pregnancy. The silver lining for you is that your child might inherit most of his estate, I continued. I won't be responsible for the baby, just Marianne and I will split our assets evenly, and you'll receive alimony. But unless my brother had more savings than I realized, you'll likely need a job in a few years. Unless, of course, my parents decide to assist you, considering you'd be giving them another grandchild and the only one from Wayne. The kids chose to live with me, so the judge awarded me the house until my youngest graduated from college. Susan's lawyer was outraged, but the judge seemed to balance things out. Knowing about Susan's infidelity, despite our no-fault state, the divorce was finalized 6 months later. Wayne passed away shortly after, adding to Susan and my parents' turmoil. I deliberately avoided attending the funeral, as I had warned I could be vengeful. Nearly 2 months later, Susan gave birth to a healthy boy, as my children excitedly informed me. They welcomed their new half-brother warmly, though they understood my limits. While I wouldn't harm the child, I wouldn't take on the role of his deceased father, teaching him sports or life skills. I knew my boundaries, even in my self-proclaimed decency. After my children informed me that their mother had moved in with my parents shortly after giving birth to her child, she eventually secured a part-time job to contribute to expenses during her work hours. My mother looked after the child, since both of my parents firmly supported Susan in this situation and repeatedly advised me to accept her actions and move forward. I felt compelled to take the only action I deemed appropriate, cutting them both out of my life. I blocked their numbers and stopped attending any family gatherings. The only individuals I maintained contact with, besides my children, were Ronnie and Diana, with the condition that they never divulge my whereabouts or activities to my parents or ex-wife. Although it was a difficult request for my sister Ronnie, she made it clear that she would end their marriage if she didn't comply. Aware of the fragile state of her marriage, Diana wisely remained silent. My children fully understood my decision and never protested my absence from family gatherings. We celebrated Christmas, birthdays, and other important occasions a day or two after the rest of the family convened. The only exceptions were my children's weddings. I assured them both that I wouldn't allow my ex-wife or former family to prevent me from attending their special days. However, I left it to them to inform the rest of the family that I wouldn't tolerate any mistreatment. I promised my children that I wouldn't be the one to mar their weddings. My daughter was the first to marry, 6 years after the divorce. I proudly escorted her down the aisle and then took my place next to my ex-wife on the bride's side of the front row. At one point during the ceremony, Susan attempted to hold my hand, but I quickly withdrew it, conveying my stance. Marianne orchestrated it so that I sat with family friends instead of at the family table. By now, everyone was aware of my divorce from Susan due to her infidelity, so there was no need to rehash the circumstances. We all seemed to enjoy ourselves at the table, and I made sure to mingle and fulfill my duties as the event's host, considering I footed the bill. Throughout the night, I visited every table for a few minutes, even approaching the family table to express gratitude for their attendance. My ex-wife and my parents gave me strange looks as I thanked them and moved on. I danced with every woman at my table and several others throughout the evening, noticing Susan glancing at me occasionally. Though I had no intention of inviting her, "Are you not going to ask Mom to dance at least once, Dad?" Marianne questioned me after some time. "After all, both of you are the reason I'm here tonight." "No, sweetheart, I won't. I'm sorry, but I have no interest." "Let's not spoil the evening," I replied. I could see Marianne contemplating, perhaps wanting to press the matter further, but ultimately deciding against it. She walked over to her mother, engaging in conversation while shaking her head. Susan glanced at me with tears in her eyes. 2 years later, I didn't foot the bill for my son's wedding. Instead, he addressed his family situation with his future in-laws, and once again, I found myself seated at a table among friends. He confided in me about the explanations he owed to his fiancée's parents. Initially repulsed by the story, they eventually showed great understanding towards me. Susan, however, felt betrayed that our son had implicated her and threatened to boycott the event. I felt immense pride when Will informed her that he would miss her at the wedding but wouldn't apologize for speaking the truth. "This isn't my doing, Mom," I overheard him say over the phone. "You made your decision. I'm just the messenger here." I had to face Amy's parents and explain that my mom had an affair with my dad's brother. It was incredibly humiliating. 12 years post-divorce, I sat in my favorite pub on a Friday night, enjoying a glass of Glenmorangie single malt with a splash of water. It had been a challenging yet rewarding week, so I indulged in some top-notch scotch. Since my divorce, I had dated on occasion but never found someone who could replace Susan in my heart. I never denied it, I was deeply in love with her, and her betrayal had wounded me deeply. perhaps I still harbored feelings for her. If I were honest with myself, nevertheless, I took pride in the fact that I hadn't spiraled into alcoholism or pursued meaningless flings. I had my work, supportive friends, and hobbies, many of which I had picked up after the divorce. It wasn't the same life I had with Susan, but it wasn't a bad life either. I didn't pay much attention to the man seated to my right until I noticed a hand extending in my direction. He introduced himself as Melvin Downey, and I reciprocated the gesture. "Yeah, I recognize you, you're Susan's first husband. We have a common experience," he remarked in a friendly manner. I chuckled with enthusiasm. Perhaps I would get along with this individual. "Well, let's hope we don't share heartache as well," I responded. I wasn't aware Susan had remarried. My children mentioned she had been seeing someone, but they neglected to inform me about the marriage. "They probably didn't want to upset you," he suggested. "Yeah, they're considerate like that," I agreed. Can I ask you something?" he inquired nervously. "Of course," I said, noticing beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Do you think she'll cheat on me too? Do you believe in the saying once a cheater, always a cheater?" I observed his anxious expression. Initially, I considered leaving him uncertain, but his situation with Susan wasn't my concern. "No, I don't subscribe to that saying," I reassured him. "In fact, I believe Susan will make an effort to be a good wife to you." I made sure to confront her behavior. Besides, she wouldn't want to appear promiscuous to our children again, once was sufficient. He expressed sincere gratitude, seemingly unaware of the relieved sigh he let out. Yes, I was starting to like this man. "Are you a regular visitor here?" he asked. "Yes, I usually come by most Friday nights. It's a nice, quiet place with friendly company," I responded. "Would it be all right if I stopped by from time to time?" "Just for a chat, nothing more," he suggested. "Sure, that would be fine." Over time, Mel and I developed a strong friendship. We often met at the bar and occasionally played golf together. What really solidified our bond was our unspoken agreement not to discuss a certain woman we both knew. Once she asked Mel if I ever mentioned her, and when he said I hadn't, it drove her crazy. He found it hilarious and teased me about it for weeks. I used to think Mel exaggerated until I unexpectedly ran into Susan at an Applebee's during lunch. As I enjoyed my burger, Susan, looking furious, sat down at my table without invitation. "Well, Susan, please make yourself comfortable," I remarked sarcastically once she settled in. "What the hell, Jeff? My husband thinks highly of you, but you never attend any family events I'm part of, except for the kids' weddings. It's clear now, Jeff. You've made it obvious that I'm the problem here. I messed up, Jeff. I can't change that. All I can do is apologize," she complained. "And that's exactly the issue, Susan. Some things can't be erased with just a casual apology."